this. Let's take it backwards, and let's look at the second part of this clause first. That's there in in verse 12. I also have become as you are. What Paul is really saying with that is resist checklist spirituality. How does this phrase suggest to us that we are able to resist checklist spirituality? Well, Paul is telling us that when he came to the Galatians, that he came to them and became less of a legalist. Now, I suspect he was already less of a legalist after he came to Christ. But when he came to the Galatians, he became less of a legalist. He became like them. He adapted to how they were, these Gentiles, how they did life together. See, adaptation to your society is the opposite of legalism. Now, we don't want to adapt into all of the immoral things, but what he says is, I became like you. I freed myself from the constraints of living under the law, living by my own cultural norms. I adapted your cultural norms. I lived more like you. I gave up the single most distinctive part of living as a Jew, and I started living the way you live. And Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Paul's basically saying in this, I didn't let any standards tell me how I was to behave, who I was to separate myself from. I went to everyone and lived as they live. Now, you could look at that language and you could say, okay, so what are you saying, man? Are you saying that there's no standards, that we can live however we want to live? No. That is not what Paul is saying either. Look at that in verse 21 on the screen. He says, I became as one outside the law, but then note the parenthesis. He's not outside the law of God. That's the moral law. And Paul is saying, I abandoned those legal restrictions that separated me and made me a Jew, that said I'm distinct and separate from the rest of the cultures of the world. But that doesn't absolve me from obeying God's moral law. The moral law is still a part of his life. But he is under the law of Christ, which means that he is free in all the other restrictions, the culturally normative restrictions. And that means that there's no checklist, really. And so when he says to the weak, I became weak, what he's really saying is, I learned to get inside people's questions. I learned to feel their needs, their difficulties, their issues. I walked in their shoes. And that doesn't mean that I got addicted so that I could reach people that were addicted. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, I in order to reach the suffering, in order to reach those with addiction, I had to shed some of the ideas that I had about addiction so that I could see them where they were. I learned to live like those that I went to live among so that I could see where their boundaries were in terms of their perceptions of living for Christ. And so I had to live outside of my legalistic upbringing. Now, that doesn't mean that he stopped being obedient, but he stopped saying, oh, this practice, this sacrifice, or this thing that I eat or don't eat is what's going to set me apart. Because that setting apart action has already happened permanently in Christ. And so I don't need to keep doing the ritual to find the acceptance. We talked about it in our Sunday school class, the bronze altar today, in which the ritual of sacrifice had to happen over and over and over. But Hebrews tells us that Christ has sacrificed once for all, and that he sits down at the right hand of the Father, which means that the sacrifices are finished. It's done. Now, let's stop to take note of something. There is one thing amongst all of these things that Paul is talking about that he is willing to give up in order to reach some that he would never, ever, 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 ever give up. He'll never do it. And what's fascinating is that it's really the whole book of Galatians that tells us about this. He says, live free, but Paul is absolutely unyieldingly inflexible and hard-nosed about what the gospel is. That's something that he will never sacrifice. He says, I'm willing to die for this one statement. I'm saved by Jesus' performance. On that, I'll die for. On that hill, I'll die. Nothing I can do can save, but what Jesus did saves, and I'll fight for that. I would take on angels. Remember what he said all the way back in chapter 1? But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. To be accursed means, may they go to hell. That's what Paul is saying. He says, even though I'm absolutely inflexible about the gospel, I'm pretty bendy when it comes to cultural things. Because there's only one box on the checklist. If you need to keep one, just write in one box. Do I trust Jesus' work on the cross? Yes or no? All the rest of the stuff is minor stuff. And Paul is saying, major in the majors, don't make a federal case out of the minor stuff. When you major in the majors, you are absolutely unyielding about the centrality of the gospel, and then you become more charitable about all of those non-essentials. It's one of the distinctives of the evangelical free church. Charity in non-essentials. You all want to eat meat sacrificed to idols? Okay, just don't make anyone stumble over it. You want to circumcise your kids? Okay. You don't want to circumcise your kids? Okay. It's not a major. Just look at how Jesus handled all of the non-essentials. He healed a man's hand on the Sabbath. That was considered a stonable offense. Talk about majoring in minors. And Jesus asked, what's it better to do? Is it better to heal or obey? He's getting to the point, isn't he? The disciples plucked grain and ate it on the Sabbath. Definitely worthy of some sort of sanction, isn't it? No, it's a minor point. It's a minor issue. Jesus talked with undesirables. He forgave sinners. He touched lepers. Oh my goodness, what is he doing? What he's displaying is there's all of these minor issues that people have made into these major issues, and he's like, I'm not about those things. He's all about all these things that the elites said were bad. You're bad. Don't do those things. That's bad. Because Jesus was always dialoguing with people. He'd ask a question and people would respond to them, and then he'd respond to what their response was. His whole purpose, though, was to help them see God. That's what he was majoring in. And the only people who really seemed to get under his skin were the rule keepers. Those people that he called, and by the way, these are all quotations, hypocrites, blind guides, vipers, fools, whitewashed tombs, children of hell. Heesh. Those are the rule keepers. Seems like he didn't really like them much. Paul says, that's the model. So when Paul says, I became like you, we're talking about the culturally normative stuff. You know, maybe the Galatian churches had crawfish bakes. And Paul was like, yeah, crawfish. I'd never eaten those before until I came with you. Maybe it was a spiral ham. I don't know.